thought I was just helping a stranded biker on Highway 95, but when he showed up at my door that evening with tears in his eyes and a manila envelope in his hands, I realized this stranger was about to change everything I thought I knew about my own family. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night in late October, and I was driving home from what felt like the longest shift of my nursing career. 16 hours at Desert Valley Medical Center had left me drained, my scrub still smelling like antiseptic and my eyes burning from exhaustion. The desert highway stretched endlessly ahead, lit only by my headlights cutting through the darkness. Character introduction: Vivienne. My name is Vivienne Chen, and at 34, I thought I had life figured out. I'd been an emergency room nurse for 8 years, living in the same Phoenix house where my father raised me after my mother died. Dad had been gone for 6 months now, and I was still trying to figure out how to live without his steady presence and endless wisdom. That's when I saw him, a massive figure hunched over a broken-down Harley-Davidson on the shoulder, tools scattered across the asphalt like fallen stars. Even from a distance, I could see the frustration in his body language as he kicked at the chrome exhaust pipe. My first instinct was to keep driving. A lone woman stopping for a stranger at midnight wasn't exactly safe, and recent news stories about highway crimes had been playing on repeat in my mind. But then I heard my father's voice, as clear as if he were sitting in the passenger seat. Character isn't what you do when it's easy, Viv. It's what you do when you're scared. Thomas Chen had drilled that lesson into me since childhood, and even 6 months after his funeral, his words still carried more weight than my fear. I slowed down and got a better look at the stranded rider. He was older than I'd expected, maybe late 50s, with salt and pepper hair visible beneath his helmet and hands that looked like they'd seen decades of hard work. His leather jacket was worn but well-maintained, and despite his intimidating size, something about his posture suggested vulnerability rather than threat. When he looked up at my approaching headlights, I caught a glimpse of eyes that seemed tired in a way that went deeper than just mechanical trouble. I pulled over, my heart hammering as I rolled down my window. The desert air was surprisingly cold, carrying the scent of sage and motor oil. "You need help?" I called out, keeping my car in drive just in case. He straightened up slowly, and that's when I noticed the small American flag patch on his jacket sleeve and the way he carried himself with military precision despite his obvious exhaustion. "I hate to bother you, miss," he said, his voice gravelly, but respectful. "Bike's been giving me trouble for the last 50 miles. Phone's got no signal out here." There was something in his tone that reminded me of my father, a particular way veterans spoke when they didn't want to burden anyone but clearly needed assistance. As I reached for my phone to call the LAA, I had no idea that this simple act of roadside assistance was about to unravel a 55-year-old mystery. I didn't know that the man standing beside my car had been carrying a debt he'd never been able to repay, or that my father's dog tags hanging from my rearview mirror were about to trigger a revelation that would change both our lives forever. All I knew was that stopping felt right, even if it felt scary, and that my dad would have been proud of me for choosing compassion over caution. The house felt different without my father's presence. Every morning, I'd wake up expecting to smell his coffee brewing in the kitchen, or hear him humming old Johnny Cash songs while reading the newspaper. Instead, silence greeted me like an unwelcome roommate. Thomas Chen had been my anchor for 34 years, and now I was drifting in ways I never thought possible. 3 weeks after the funeral, I discovered Dad had been hiding more than just his pain. Medical bills from his 2-year battle with lung cancer were stacked in neat piles inside his desk drawer, organized with the same military precision he'd applied to everything else. $47,000 in debt that Medicare hadn't covered. Experimental treatments, specialist consultations, prescription medications that cost more than my monthly mortgage. He'd never said a word, just kept telling me everything was fine while quietly hemorrhaging his life savings. That's how I ended up pulling double shifts at Desert Valley Medical Center. 16-hour days became my new normal, trading my social, life, and sanity for overtime pay. My colleagues started commenting on my exhaustion, but I couldn't slow down. Every extra dollar went toward paying off Dad's debts, and every moment of rest felt like I was dishonoring his memory. Evenings were the hardest. I'd come home to find cardboard boxes still packed in the living room, filled with Dad's belongings I couldn't bring myself to sort through. His army uniform hung in the hall closet, still carrying the faint scent of his cologne. His Vietnam service medals sat in a small display case on the mantel, but he'd never talked about earning them. Whenever I'd asked about the war, he'd simply say, "Some stories are better left buried, sweetheart." Dad had raised me with clear principles after Mom died in that car accident when I was 12. "We help people because that's what makes us human," he'd say every time we stopped to assist a neighbor or stranger. "When you stop helping, you stop living." Those words had guided me into nursing, shaped my character, and made me the person I was. But lately I wondered if I was helping everyone except myself. My Aunt Celeste in Portland had been calling weekly, suggesting I sell the house and start fresh somewhere new. "You're burying yourself alive in that place, honey," she'd say. "Thomas wouldn't want you sacrificing your future for his past." Part of me knew she was right. I was 34, single, and so consumed with honoring Dad's memory that I'd forgotten how to build my own life. That Tuesday night in late October, I was driving home from another grueling shift, feeling particularly defeated. We'd lost a patient around my father's age, and it had triggered the familiar wave of grief that still caught me off guard. The desert highway was empty except for the occasional semi-truck, and my thoughts were spiraling in the usual direction. I'd started playing old home videos on my phone during these drives, just to hear Dad's voice. That night, it was footage from my nursing school graduation. "I'm so proud of you, Viv," his recorded voice filled the car. "You're going to save lives and make a difference. That's what we're here for." The irony wasn't lost on me that I was helping everyone at the hospital while slowly drowning in his leftover problems. As I rounded the curve near mile marker 127, my mind was made up about calling Aunt Celeste in the morning. Maybe it was time to accept her offer, sell the house, and start over in Portland. Maybe carrying Dad's legacy didn't mean carrying his debts. Maybe I could honor his memory by finally choosing my own happiness. That's when my headlights caught the figure hunched over the broken motorcycle, and everything I thought I knew about my father's impact on the world was about to be rewritten by a stranger who'd been carrying a 55-year-old debt of gratitude. As my headlights swept across the broken-down Harley, I could see Rex more clearly. He was kneeling beside his bike, a large man made smaller by frustration and the vast emptiness of the desert night. Tools were scattered around him like he'd been fighting this mechanical problem for hours. His leather jacket was unzipped despite the cold, sweat visible on his forehead even in the dim light. The motorcycle, a classic 1995 Harley-Davidson with chrome that still gleamed despite its age, sat silent and defeated. My foot hovered between the brake and gas pedal as competing voices battled in my head. Dad's teachings pulled me toward the shoulder, while every news story about highway crimes pushed me forward. This wasn't just about helping a stranger anymore. This was about whether I still had the courage to live by the principles that had shaped me, or if grief and fear had fundamentally changed who I was becoming. I pulled over about 20 feet behind his bike, leaving my engine running and doors unlocked. Through my rolled-down window, I called out, "Everything okay over there?" Rex looked up, surprise evident on his weathered face. Under the harsh glare of my headlights, I could see he was older than I'd initially thought, probably pushing 60, with kind eyes that seemed grateful but cautious. "I hate to bother you, miss," he replied, standing slowly and wiping his hands on a red shop rag. "Bike's been giving me trouble for the last 50 miles. Started sputtering around Flagstaff and finally just died on me. Phone's got no signal out here." His voice carried a slight southern accent mixed with something else, measured and respectful in a way that reminded me of Dad's generation. There was no aggression in his posture, just the tired resignation of a man whose carefully planned journey had hit an unexpected obstacle. I stepped out of my car cautiously, keeping the driver's door open. "I'm a nurse," I said, as if that somehow made me qualified to help with motorcycle repairs. "Let me try calling AOA for you. Sometimes I get better signal than other people out here." Rex's eyes softened at the mention of my profession, and he nodded gratefully. That's mighty kind of you. Name's Rex Whitmore, and I sure would appreciate the help. While dialing 8AA, I noticed the small details that told Rex's story. Without words, his jacket was well maintained but clearly decades old, with patches from various motorcycle rallies and a small American flag sewn near the shoulder. His boots were military style, broken in but polished. Most telling were his hands, scarred and calloused in ways that spoke of both manual labor and something harder to define. The tow truck dispatcher estimated a 45-minute wait, so Rex and I found ourselves talking to fill the time. He leaned against his bike while I sat on my car's hood, the desert silence broken only by our conversation and the distant hum of occasional traffic. "You heading somewhere important?" I asked. Rex's expression grew somber. "Cross-country trip. Visiting families of some old friends who didn't make it home." Something in his tone made me look closer at his jacket. That's when I spotted it, the small Marine Corps emblem near his left pocket. "You served?" I asked. Rex nodded. 2 tours, in Vietnam, long time ago. Some experiences stay with you forever. Without thinking, I mentioned that my father had served too, gesturing toward Dad's dog tags hanging from my rearview mirror. Rex's entire demeanor changed when he saw those tags. He walked closer to my car, squinting at the metal discs in the dim interior light. "Thomas Chen," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. 173rd Airborne Brigade. The blood drained from his face as he stepped backward, one hand reaching out to steady himself against my car. "That can't be right. You know my father?" I asked, my heart suddenly racing for entirely different reasons. Rex's hands were shaking as he pulled out a worn leather notebook from his jacket pocket. His fingers fumbled through pages covered in neat handwriting until he found what he was looking for. "Thomas Chen, emergency medic, 173rd Airborne, served near Da Nang from March to November 1969. He looked up at me with eyes that were now filled with something between shock and what looked like relief. "Your father," Rex said, his voice cracking slightly, "saved my life 55 years ago." The words hung in the desert air between us like a bridge spanning decades. Everything about this random encounter suddenly felt less random and more like destiny finally keeping an appointment it had scheduled long before either of us was ready for it. As the tow truck's headlights appeared in the distance, Rex closed his notebook and looked at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Miss Chen, would it be possible for me to follow you home tonight? There's something I've been carrying for your father for over half a century, and I think it's time you had it." Rex stared at my father's dog tags like he was seeing a ghost. His weathered hands trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. Even in the dim light from my car's interior, I could see it was a black and white military photo of 2 young soldiers in combat gear, arms draped over each other's shoulders with exhausted smiles. One of them looked unmistakably like my father at 19 years old. "November 15th, 1969, Rex said, his voice thick with emotion. "We were on patrol near Da Nang when our convoy hit an improvised explosive device. My vehicle flipped and caught fire, and I was trapped inside with a broken leg and smoke filling my lungs. I was ready to die in that metal coffin." He paused, looking directly at me with eyes that had carried this memory for over 5 decades. Then this skinny medic comes running through enemy fire, screaming my name, pulling at the door with strength. That shouldn't have been possible for someone his size. Rex continued, his words painting a picture I'd never heard before. "Your father spent 40 minutes under direct fire, using a crowbar and pure determination to pry me out of that wreckage. He dragged me 200 yards to safety while bullets were flying overhead, then worked on my injuries for another hour until the medevac helicopter arrived. The doctor said if he'd been 5 minutes later, I would have died from smoke inhalation. I was unconscious when they airlifted me to Japan, then Germany, then back to Walter Reed in D.C. By the time I was coherent enough to ask about Thomas, he'd rotated back to the States and I had no way to find him. The Army couldn't release personal information, and this was decades before the internet made finding people easy." Rex's voice cracked slightly. "For 55 years I've carried the knowledge that I never properly thanked the man who gave me my life back. Rex explained how he'd spent decades trying to locate my father through various channels. Veterans Affairs, military reunion websites, even hiring a private investigator in the 1990s. I found dozens of Thomas Chens, but none of them were the right one. Your dad had moved around after the service, changed addresses, and by the time I got close to tracking him down in Phoenix, the trail had gone cold again. From his notebook, Rex carefully extracted a yellowed envelope addressed to Medic Thomas Chen, 173rd Airborne Brigade. The letter inside, written in Rex's younger handwriting, was dated December 1969. I wrote this from my hospital bed, he explained. Poured my heart out about what your father did, how he changed my life, how I wanted to repay him somehow. But I had no address to send it to. Rex revealed that his cross-country motorcycle trip wasn't just about visiting families of fallen soldiers. It was also his final attempt to find Thomas Chen. I'm 58 years old, and my health isn't what it used to be. This was my last chance to complete the circle, to finally deliver this thank you letter and settle a debt that's been eating at me for decades. When I told Rex that Dad had passed away 6 months ago, the big man actually staggered. He sat down heavily on the guardrail, his head in his hands. I was too late, he whispered. All these years, and I was too late. For several minutes we sat in silence while Rex processed the reality that his quest to thank his savior had ended before it could begin. But then something shifted in Rex's expression. He looked at me with renewed purpose. Maybe I wasn't meant to find Thomas. Maybe I was meant to find you. He stood up with the deliberate movement of a man who'd just discovered his true mission. Your father saved my life, and now I'm going to make sure his daughter gets the recognition and support she deserves. Rex pulled out his phone and showed me photos of documents he'd been carrying for years. Military commendations, witness statements from other soldiers, even correspondence with the Pentagon about Thomas's service record. Your father was a hero, and I have the proof. But more than that, I've been saving something for him all these years, something that belongs to his family now. As the tow truck finally arrived, Rex made an unexpected request. Miss Chen, would you allow me to follow you home tonight? I've got something in my motel room that your father earned, and I think it's time his daughter knew the full truth about the man who raised her. The intensity in his voice convinced me this wasn't just about closure for him anymore. This was about discovering a part of my father I'd never known existed. Rex arrived at my house 40 minutes later, carrying not just the manila envelope I'd seen earlier, but also a weathered wooden box and what looked like a small leather portfolio. His motorcycle rumbled quietly in my driveway as he carefully balanced these items, treating them like sacred relics. The porch light illuminated his face, and I could see he'd been crying during the ride over. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Dad and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations. Rex opened the manila envelope with trembling fingers and spread out photocopied documents that looked official and important. These are your father's complete military records, he said. I've been carrying copies for decades, hoping to return them someday. The papers revealed commendations I'd never seen before. A Bronze Star with V device for valor, a Purple Heart he'd never mentioned, and witness statements from 6 different soldiers describing Thomas Chen's actions under fire. One statement, signed by Rex's commanding officer, detailed how my father had saved 3 men during that November ambush, not just Rex. Your dad never told you about any of this? Rex asked, though my shocked expression had already answered his question. Rex opened the small wooden box next, revealing his own Purple Heart medal nestled in faded velvet. This was mine, he said, lifting it carefully, but I want you to have it. Your father earned this more than I did. He was the one who suffered the real wounds that day, watching his friends get hurt and risking everything to save us. The medal felt impossibly heavy in my palm, warm from Rex's touch and weighted with decades of gratitude. From the leather portfolio, Rex produced the yellowed envelope I'd seen at the highway. Inside was a 3-page letter written in the careful handwriting of a young man processing trauma and gratitude. Reading it felt like glimpsing into my father's impact through someone else's eyes. The letter described not just the rescue, but how Thomas had visited Rex in the field hospital afterward, bringing him books and playing cards to help pass the recovery time. Because your father saved me that day, I got to come home, Rex continued, his voice steady but emotional. I met my wife Sarah in 1971, had 3 kids, and worked as a mechanic for 42 years. I got to walk my daughters down the aisle, hold my grandchildren, build a life that was only possible because Thomas Chen refused to leave a man behind. Rex reached into his jacket and pulled out a cashier's check that made my breath catch in my throat. $47,000, made out to Vivian Chen. I've been setting aside money for your father since 1975, he explained. Every month, without fail, I put away what I could afford. It started as $20, then $50, then more as my career progressed. I called it my Thomas Fund. I researched your situation after I found out about Thomas, Rex admitted. I know about the medical bills, the double shifts, the financial pressure you've been under. This money represents every good day I got to live because your father saved me. Every Christmas morning with my grandkids, every anniversary with my wife, every sunset I got to see because I didn't die in that burning vehicle. I stared at the check, unable to process what I was seeing. This amount would clear all of Dad's medical debts and give me breathing room I hadn't had in months. Rex, I can't accept this, I whispered. But he shook his head firmly. You don't understand, he said. This isn't charity. This is a debt payment that's 55 years overdue. Rex stood up and walked to my mantel where Dad's service medals were displayed. Thomas saved my life, and then he raised a daughter who stopped on a dark highway to help a stranger. The same compassion, the same courage, just passed down through generations. He turned back to me with tears in his eyes. Your father's legacy isn't just in those medals or military records. It's in who you've become. As I held Rex's purple heart in one hand and the life-changing check in the other, I finally understood what Dad had been trying to teach me all those years. Helping others wasn't just about being kind. It was about creating ripples of goodness that could travel across decades and come back to lift you up when you needed it most. Your father didn't just save my life that day in Vietnam, Rex said, softly. He saved yours too, because without him, you wouldn't exist. And without you stopping tonight, I would have died on that highway carrying a 55-year-old burden. We saved each other, Vivian. That's what your dad would have wanted. The next morning, I woke up in my father's house with Rex's check on my nightstand and his purple heart next to Dad's display case. For the first time in 6 months, I didn't feel the crushing weight of financial anxiety pressing down on my chest. I called the medical billing office at 8 a.m. sharp and paid off every single one of Dad's outstanding debts. The woman on the phone seemed shocked that someone was paying such a large amount in full, but I could barely contain my joy as I heard her say, "Your account balance is now 0. With the financial pressure gone, I was able to reduce my shifts at Desert Valley Medical Center from 16 hours back to normal 8-hour days. My colleagues noticed the change immediately. Sarah Martinez, one of the senior nurses, cornered me during lunch. "You look like you actually slept last night," she said with a smile. "What happened?" When I told her about Rex and the highway encounter, she just shook her head in amazement. "Your dad's still taking care of you from heaven." Rex kept his promise to visit monthly, always arriving on the second Saturday with stories about my father I'd never heard. He brought photo albums from Vietnam, showing me pictures of Dad as a young medic treating wounded soldiers with the same gentle care I'd seen him give to injured animals and neighborhood kids. Through Rex, I met other veterans from the 173rd Airborne who remembered Thomas Chen as the medic who never said no to helping someone in need. One of those veterans, Henry Rodriguez, lived just 40 miles away in Tucson. When he learned about my nursing background, he mentioned his struggle to afford his diabetic medications on a fixed income. Without hesitation, I used part of Rex's gift to help cover Henry's prescription costs for 6 months. "This is what your dad would have done," Rex said when I told him. "The money's doing exactly what it was meant to do." That gesture sparked an idea that grew into something bigger than I'd imagined. I took $5,000 from Rex's gift and established the Thomas Chen Memorial Fund, specifically designed to help veterans' families with unexpected medical expenses. Rex became my first official board member, and Henry helped spread the word through veteran networks across Arizona. Within 3 months, we'd helped 12 families. Our first major case was Maria Santos, whose husband had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before losing his battle with PTSD. She was drowning in funeral costs and grief counseling expenses for her 2 young children. When we handed her a check for $3,000, she broke down crying in my living room. "Angels exist," she whispered. "They just look like regular people." The cardboard boxes in my living room, which had sat untouched for 8 months, finally got unpacked. Instead of painful reminders of loss, Dad's belongings became treasures that told the story of a man whose impact reached further than I'd ever known. His Vietnam journals, which I'd been too scared to read, revealed a young medic who wrote about finding purpose in healing others during humanity's darkest moments. Rex's revelation changed how I saw my own work at the hospital. Every patient became someone's Thomas Chen or Rex Whitmore, someone whose recovery might ripple forward in ways I'd never know. When Mrs. Patterson, an elderly patient, thanked me for staying late to comfort her during a panic attack, I heard Dad's voice again. We help people because that's what makes us human. A year later, Rex and I were featured in the Phoenix Veterans newsletter, standing together beside Dad's grave on Memorial Day. The article was titled, "A Highway Encounter That Honors All Who Served." Rex had his arm around my shoulders like the uncle I'd never had, and we were both wearing Thomas Chen Memorial Fund t-shirts that Henry had designed. As I read Rex's original letter to my father one more time, I finally understood the profound lesson embedded in our story. Dad's legacy wasn't diminished by the medical bills he'd left behind or the stories he'd never told. His legacy lived in every life he'd touched, every act of kindness that rippled forward, and every moment when someone chose to help a stranger on a dark highway. Standing in my kitchen, looking at the wall where I'd hung Rex's Purple Heart next to Dad's medals, I realized that helping others was never about being repaid. It was about creating a world where kindness could travel across decades, where a moment of courage in Vietnam could save a struggling nurse in Arizona 55 years later. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply show up for someone else, because you never know when the universe might be preparing to show up for you.